Hi, everyone. We're back, and this is segment 2 of Lewis's story. Lewis, you just got done telling us about all the first symptoms that you felt, all the appointments, having to listen to that inner voice, and finally getting that CT scan that showed there was cancer and how you were able to, quote, process it in the moment. So thank you for that. And that is, again, for segment 1 for anyone who wants to watch that. This segment, we're going to be talking about the treatment that you underwent, which of course is the fun part, and the impact to your life. So before we start there, I know you did get a biopsy done of the lymph nodes, right? They were able to diagnose that you had diffuse large B cell, stage 4B with double expressor, which, by the way, mine was the same diagnosis except stage 3. So we have that in common. I want to understand, when your doctor was talking to you after he told you this is what you have specifically, what was that treatment conversation like? And did you research on your own and say, what about this? Or was it very straightforward?
It was pretty straightforward and very helpful. What happened was my pulmonologist called me back to say that the biopsy had come back as diffuse large B cell lymphoma, stage 4B. I actually found out that it was double expressor from my oncologist later. That was fine. I had an initial oncology appointment with an oncologist and with the coordinating nurse present. Actually, 2 coordinating nurses because one was retiring. And that's the first time that I heard that lymphoma was treatable and might even be curable. He, stated that, R-CHOP in my case was the preferred, preferred chemo. That generally it was well tolerated by patients, and that it could be very effective, and that I would need to get, a port inserted so that the chemo could be administered efficiently. He asked some questions. Answered them. My wife was there, which was good. It was the one appointment that she was able to go to. This was still sort of high COVID. And so basically, yeah, well, there's emotional stuff around the initial oncology appointment that we'll talk about in segment 3. But, essentially he sort of laid out R-CHOP, he laid out the schedule, 6 rounds. Also laid out in my case, because there was an extranodal presentation in my spine, lower spine, that I would also be doing methotrexate prophylaxis, inpatient, to guard against the possibility of CNS involvement, or it's spreading to my brain basically. And we essentially set up a schedule, set up a follow-up appointment, and I was off to the races. The next thing after that was to get a port/line inserted. Turned out to be a problem. And then, starting my first R-CHOP on 12/22, I believe it was.
Yeah. You started the first R-CHOP, that's right, December 22nd. I'm sure you remember that very clearly. I do like to point out, you had this experience. They said you'd get a port, but you got a PICC line, which I also had the same experience. I did eventually get a port, and then I had a PICC line again at the end of that. But sometimes if your tumors are in a certain location and they can't place the port, they will first give you the PICC line, which of course, for most people is through the arm. For you, can you just, we don't have to go too deeply into this, but for anyone who's curious about the PICC line, is there any tips in terms of how to deal with it, what the experience is like?
Yeah, I do actually. If you are going to be getting a PICC line, I think it's very important to make sure that you don't go home until you have all of the flushing supplies, and that you've had a conversation with someone about what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, because you have to keep that very clean, and so that's
you got to keep it very clean. You have to keep it flushed with heparin. It requires, at least in my case, it required nightly maintenance.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing to it, right? Steps. Take off the cap, sterilize your hands, all of that good stuff.
Right.
Flush it, put it back, get the little mesh sleeve back up. And the PICC line is in a way it's you know it's on when you have a PICC line, because there's this thing, sticking out of your arm connected to, some pretty major blood vessels, and that's where the chemo is going to go. And I had a similar experience, which is I found out actually in the parking lot before I went in to get a port inserted that one of my tumors was too large to have a port placed. It was occupying the space, unfortunately, and that I would need a PICC line. And actually, I wound up getting a PICC line in my left arm.
I think me too. I was trying to look to see where my markings are. And another tip for people is, you have to keep your PICC line dry. So in showers, they do still have those sleeves. I really actually liked those covers. I know some people do like saran wrap and other things, but I found those covers to be really, really helpful. But thank you, Louis, for sharing that, because I think that'll be very helpful for people. The R-CHOP, could you describe, I know it was 6 cycles. Can you describe, how long the infusions were, and then, how many weeks you had off before you went back and had your next cycle?
Sure. I did R-CHOP 21, which is R-CHOP every 21 days. And the infusion cycles, the length of them change. My first one was longer because they want to, I think, slow play the Rituxan to make sure that you don't have a reaction to it.
Do you remember, did they say anything about Rituxan and reactions for patients?
I'm sure that they did. I'm sure that for my first R-CHOP, my first chemo, maybe my second chemo, I was just still kind of reeling. So I'm sure that I don't remember everything that was said. I do remember having a pretty extensive conversation with my practitioner about the drugs that were going to be given to me. And he did send me for an echocardiogram to make sure that my heart could sustain, I believe it was the, I don't know if it was the vancomycin or the vincristine. I don't know. I forget which. Anthracycline, I think, is the family of drugs. But there's one of the R-CHOP drugs can be fairly cardiotoxic. So they want to make sure that your heart's in decent shape before you go. And so I did that. The only thing that I remember about the Rituxan is being specifically told that my first infusion would be longer because they were going to do slow Rituxan, just to make sure that I didn't have a bad reaction to it.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience I've heard. It's a slow sort of to make sure that there's no reaction. And so that's why I was really happy that you brought that up. I think that tends to be pretty common practice. And I also love that you're bringing up, look, my mind was reeling. There was a lot on my plate. There were a lot of things that were thrown at you in the beginning. And me too, I remember. And how are you supposed to remember it all, right? So I think it's important for people to realize it's sometimes too much to digest. It might have been the cyclophosphamide, because that's one of the drugs that I remember for me was like, yeah, I had to get an echocardiogram as well and make sure the heart was okay to take it. But that's another point. Before you actually get the treatment, there are all these things that have to happen, whether it's the PICC or port, all these tests to make sure that you're ready to take on the drugs. And so I'm so glad you're pointing that out. And then I would love to go into with the R-CHOP, and I know it's hard because it's a combination to figure out like what causes what, but you'd get the infusion. How long again were the infusions, like average? And then when did you start feeling the side effects? If you could describe what you felt and how long.
Okay, I would say that I would probably say that the week to 10 days after my R-CHOP was probably the best that I had felt in a long time. And I think that's because, the P in R-CHOP is, prednisone. It's a pretty powerful steroid. And what happened when I took the prednisone is that my cough essentially went away, right? And my cough had been the bane of my existence. And, the prednisone also helped with the fatigue, and it also helped with the, appetite issues. I felt like, oh, the prednisone will help with my weight. So initially, I have to say that I felt better as opposed to worse, which I don't think is an uncommon response. particularly if you're stage 4B, it's everywhere. You have all these B symptoms. And I think there was also, and I know we're going to talk about it more in the third segment, but there was also the emotional lift of, hey, my team's finally getting a point on the board, right? I'm finally fighting back. I think that my second RCHOP, I also, at that point, yeah, I did have hairs in the sink. My hair was thinning. I was maybe starting to feel a little bit more tired. But I still had what I would consider at that point, even after my second infusion, to be relatively significant relief from symptoms. All right. So I would say that the first third of my RCHOP, other than, the discomfort of the PICC and all of that, they weren't terrible. They do give you, oh, and I cannot believe I forgot the name of this. They do give you anti-nausea drugs. You get what they call pre-meds. One of them is
Zofran.
Zofran, thank you. The Zofran and also dexamethasone was one of my pre-meds, and those drugs really did a great job of controlling my nausea, to the point where I essentially had close to a nausea-free chemo.
That is incredible, by the way.
Yeah.
And dexamethasone is a steroid as well. Yes.
Yeah, it is a steroid as well. And the one thing that I would say to people starting on treatment is, if you have a side effect that is affecting your quality of life, do not assume that there's nothing that can be done about it. Contact your provider, contact them early, contact them often, because these days, there are a variety of medications that are very effective, even with pretty severe side effects. So, do not suffer in silence. Do not say, hey, I'm a cancer patient, I'm getting chemo, I'm supposed to be throwing up, I'm supposed to feel like this. It's like, well, I mean, you may feel like that, but, never accept it, but, only, I guess, be at peace with it after you've gone through all of the lines of palliative meds for side effects.
That is such a powerful reminder. So I really appreciate you bringing it up, because sometimes I think we don't want to, be a nagging patient or speak too much or whatever, but it's like the self-advocacy is incredibly important. If you're feeling something, you've got to speak up. No one else knows what we are feeling. And so thank you, Louis. And so I know you did 6 cycles of that. I would like to break down, you mentioned 2 major ones for you, fatigue and diarrhea. And, I think on the surface, when people don't go through the chemo part and they think of the regular fatigue and diarrhea, it doesn't sound like very much, but it is incredibly tough on the quality of life, both of them.
Yeah.
So I would love if you could, I would love if you could share about first the fatigue, what that feeling was like, and what you did to help you with the fatigue.
Okay. And this is, you're going to have to keep me honest, because some of my fatigue sort of shades into things that we need to talk about in the third section more appropriately, I think. No, excuse me. But cancer fatigue is like nothing in the world, in the sense that it is a tiredness that is bone deep, it's soul deep, and it does not respond to the things that you would imagine would make you less tired. Hey, I'm going to take a nap. Hey, I'm going to get an extra couple of hours of sleep. It is a weariness that really affects your ability. The way that I would put it, at least for me, during the worst of my fatigue, it was a level of weariness that literally interfered with my ability to be. It interfered with my existence. Very flattened, tough for me to do a lot once it hit. And it was a real struggle to do things like get out of bed, shower, put on clothing, come down to my, basement office, log on to work, eat, do dishes or what have you. Because one of the things that I had sort of told myself is that I was going to be as normal presenting as possible for my kids. I was going to do the things that I needed to do, and I was not going to be, one of these folks who, well, let's just say I didn't want to really present badly. But the thing about cancer fatigue or chemo fatigue, more accurately, is even if you look like your old self and you're doing something, it's like, hey, you're standing up and you're scrubbing that, that big pan you just made a huge dish in or whatever, and things look okay, you don't feel okay. Two people walking side by side down the street, one of them doing chemo and one of them not doing chemo, can look very similar, but they are having an experience that is worlds apart. The person who's having chemo fatigue could just be hanging on.
Right. No,
I got to make this next half block. I got to make it to the light. Okay, I made it to the light. I got to make it to the next mailbox.
It's literally one step at a time. No, I think that's
one
a
step
great
at a time.
What did you feel helped you with the fatigue? I mean, was there anything? Sometimes it's counterintuitive, but it's like more physical activity. Sometimes people say.
Yeah. I would say that the one thing that really, really helped, and I think the science sort of bears this out, is when I was emotionally and physically able to move and go out for a walk. All right. And it didn't have to be a ton. And you certainly don't want to, you don't want to press yourself that much when you're mid chemo in terms of, heck with this, I'm going to walk 4 miles, because you're going to pay the price. Practical advice for folks going through chemo is you're going to have reaction to your environment. One of the things that sometimes happens with chemo is you get very temperature sensitive. And I actually got very cold sensitive. And I live in Chicago. And one of the things that my wife did, God bless her, she said, you know what? I don't care what it's been. I don't care what it costs. We're getting you like some Arctic Explorer coat, okay? Because you're getting out there, regardless of the temperature. And that was incredibly helpful.
It sounds like you had a very supportive caregiver at home, which is another piece of this. Yeah. It's, the support. Thank you for sharing that. The other one I'd love to dive into, diarrhea. Yeah. No, let's get into the nitty gritty of it, because I think a lot of people experience it. And by the way, I had experienced both that and constipation, which you're like, how's it both? But anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, this is a sentence I never thought would leave my mouth, but, I actually have a constipation story for, the third segment. But the diarrhea was very difficult to deal with, because it wasn't even that it was constant. But when at least the way that I experienced it, when it grabbed me, it just took over all of my intellectual and emotional attention and physical reality for however long it took. When I had bouts, that's what I was doing. I was breathing and I was having diarrhea, because that's what there was.
Can you describe like how frequently this was happening? And was there a particular time in the cycle that it would hit the most?
It got worse as it went on. It got worse as it went on. I would say that I went from constipation-ish reality to, as you put it, the constipation / diarrhea dichotomy, which is extraordinarily difficult to explain to people who haven't been through it. And then the constipation went away and I was left with just the diarrhea. And it wasn't, look, this is a medical channel, right? And people's bodies do things, and you just sort of have to be adult about describing them. I didn't have a watery version of diarrhea. What I had was a very loose and very constant version of it. And one of the things that really affected me was, I had already been having issues with my weight. Um, I had complex about the way that I looked. And I would have diarrhea so often and for so long that it just really, it reinforced this narrative of, dude, you're wasting away. You're literally pooping out your life, into this bowl, and there's nothing you can do.
Helplessness. You felt like there was no control, right? It was just
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. And again, I did reach out to my care team. I did take my own advice, which is I reached out to them. I said, hey, this is kind of wacky. And they did give me, I think it was loperamide, for the diarrhea, and that helped. But one of the things that I think became clear to me was, until I was done with chemo, I was not going to be normal in terms of bowel movements and bowel movement quality, whatever you want to call it. It was just something I was going to have to go through. And that's sort of another message I would give to people who are in the middle of chemo. There are some things that you get through by going through them. And there's no off ramp. There's no helicopter that'll, fly over the traffic jam. You got to get through them. But I think that the good news is you can get through them.
Yeah.
You can. But I think one of the things that helps is do the things that will help you. It's like, don't suffer in silence. Call your care team. Say, hey, I really have problems with diarrhea. And then have them, prescribe something, and then get back to them about whether or not it's working.
Right.
Keep that
Absolutely.
dialogue open.
Yes.
Right?
Speak up for yourself. And I love that you're bringing that up. As another tip for people, another self-advocacy point. I want to save the hair loss in terms of the impact for the last segment as well, just because
Sure.
it's, it blends into so many other topics. But you did mention that you shaved your head.
Yeah.
Was it between which cycles was it again?
For me, I believe it was between cycles 2 and 3.
Okay, that's pretty typical because they say you start to lose your hair after the first, maybe the second. So we will go into hair loss in segment 3 for anyone who's interested in that. I do want to talk about the methotrexate prophylaxis, and that they prescribed because of your spine. Is that right? Because there was so can you, what did that look like? Was it an infusion? How long did it take? And what were the side effects, if any?
So it took, first of all, I did not have the intracapital. I had the high dose, through my PICC/port. So I had to do it inpatient. So, you go in, they admit you, they take various levels. You do get pre-meds as well. Then they give you the infusion. And I don't recall the actual infusion being that long. If I remember correctly, my first infusion started perhaps mid-evening, and it was over by midnight, certainly. It's not that long. But what winds up happening is that methotrexate is so toxic that at that point they start sort of giving you rescue bicarbonate of soda, and you have to urinate constantly and keep track of your output, and they need to pH test it. And then you need to do methotrexate levels in your blood. Methotrexate, I think, much more so than R-CHOP, has a reputation of having more neurological side effects because it does penetrate the blood-brain barrier. But other than some very slight dizziness, I have to say that I escaped methotrexate side effects as distinguishable from what was already going on with R-CHOP.
Okay, that's good. I mean, it means that you didn't have some new wave of things that hit you, which is awesome. You did 3 of those methotrexate cycles, if you will, and then I know you had a PET scan that was after your second cycle of R-CHOP.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the last PET scan, of course. The mid one, it's good for people to know that typically, and it varies when the oncologist will give you the PET scan. Sometimes they give you one after the second. Sometimes it's after the fourth cycle. And so it just depends. But for you, I won't go into the Deauville score and all that stuff because people don't really know that yet. But it basically showed that there was a strong response to the treatment, right?
Yeah, no, I still remember to this day as if it was tattooed on my hand. The radiologist's opening comments, literally the first words that you read were excellent response to treatment. You know, that was the first sentence. And it showed resolution of a lot of the swelling of the lymph nodes. You know, it showed that my delta SUV max, which is another thing that, you know, another very technical term, but it's a measure of how active your cancer is in terms of absorbing the marker that they give you when they do a PET scan, was down by over 90%. It was a very, very strong response, you know, and it was really, it was one of the first times that I thought, wow, you know, you might not be dead by spring, you know, you might actually have a chance.
That is a great response because, by the way, I was just checking my own. I forgot because I have chemo brain still, I feel like. But, you know, my last scan was a Deauville score too, which is what you had at after your second round or second
Right.
cycle. So that's great. I'd love to know, of course, the last scan with the PET scan showed that it was down to 1.
Yeah.
So what was if we don't get into the numbers, because again, people might not understand it, especially at this point, but what was your oncologist's message to you at that point?
So this is partially now and partially a 3 thing, but, you know, my oncologist, like a lot of oncologists, I think, you know, not necessarily a party animal, but I'm a huge fan of his because he was just a very, what I felt to be honest, grounded, and ethical practitioner. So I think a lot of oncologists are, and so they're very careful with what they say. You know, and I think one of the things that he said was, you know, he said, look, no one can promise you that you're not going to relapse, but this is an incredibly strong response. You know, it's actually a better response than I expected at the beginning of your case. You know, and I think that you have a very strong possibility to have a very good outcome.
Which is amazing. By the way, I just want to commend your oncologist for writing that up front on the report, because sometimes it's like, I don't like, let's not bury the lead here. What's the status? Right. And so, and since we did mention it, I mean, Deauville score, I'm not going to go into any, because this is not a technical or medical advice platform, but the way someone explained it to me, and let me know if you heard the same, is it's a score out of 5, and it's really curved though. So if you have a 5, it's pretty rough. They would almost grade that an F. A 4 is like a C. A 3 is like an A minus. 2 is an A, and a 1 is an A plus. I mean, that's how someone sort of described it to me in terms of understanding the score.
I think that's right, because I think there's very little to choose from between 1 and 2 Deauville. They're both considered CRs, or complete responses. You know, they're both things that you absolutely want to see.
Right, right.
And actually, I did have I don't want to say a consulting oncologist, but I had an oncologist who would be the person who did the rounds when I was doing methotrexate prophylaxis, sort of, I guess, an inpatient oncologist, for lack of a better term. You know, and she looked at my interim PET scan results, and she goes, you know, medically speaking, you're in remission, which I think is what Deauville 2 is. And it was the first time that I'd heard remission applied to my case. And it was quite a moment for me.
Absolutely. And actually, that's my last question before I want to really get to segment 3, because that's where there's a lot of gold, I would say. But absolutely, how did it feel for you? I mean, you had already heard remission, Deauville 2. You ended up with the Deauville score 1 at the end of it all. that day that you learned that, was it a huge weight off your shoulders, or was it, well, gosh, I just don't know if it's going to continue? And what was that for you?
It was, well, I think you know the answer to that. It was both. Um, you know, I certainly cried, um, when I read it. Um, it was just such a sense of relief. Um, but it was also okay, what now? I got to be honest with you. I think that probably the best part, the absolute best part of getting a Deauville 1 and a zero uptake, zero SUV, on my last scan had nothing to do with me. It was my ability to tell my family about it. That was really the prize, was to be able to tell my wife, hey, look at this, to be able to sit my kids down and say, hey, dad's in remission. That was really the icing on the cake. But and again, this is sort of for for 3. It's kind of like, what are the next steps after that?
Right. No, it's a huge topic. And so that's a great segue. You did a great job, I think, summarizing your treatment experience and side effects. So for everyone who's interested, this next segment 3, is going to be, I think, full of a lot of gold nuggets because, Luis, you're so willing to dive into what you were feeling and thinking. And I think that'll be very beneficial for people who are watching. So stay tuned for the next segment on quality of life impacts and living after a cancer diagnosis.